All right, Shabbos, good morning, good morning. Let us begin. We are continuing Mesillas Hashem in the 11th chapter of Mesillas Yesharim, and we find ourselves again today. I sent out the PDF as well in the Hachzek copy, page 66. Again, today is Friday, the 24th day of Cheshvan, the 18th of November, and the Ramchal continues, and he says, "Be'inyan Sinas ha'etza." So let's just remember again in yesterday's shir, the Ramchal spoke about the idea that there are certain averos that we struggle with that are interpersonal averos, and he listed a whole grouping of them. So one of the items that he mentioned was giving advice. What does it mean, giving advice? Torah says, do not place a stumbling block before a blind person. Lifnei suma badavar. Now, both say, blind person of this, of course, in this context, obviously it goes without saying that you should not place a stumbling block in front of a person who's actually blind, right? But even if the Torah had not said that, we would have understood that. The Torah is coming to convey something much more nuanced, that often people are blind in a particular area. A person doesn't have information, a person doesn't know, and therefore I have an obligation to be careful not to place a stumbling block, we'll call it an advice stumbling block, in front of someone who may be blind or compromised or ignorant in a certain area of life. For example, now he begins with some innocuous example. Well, it's not innocuous, but let's say somebody asks me about a shidduch, and they ask me, is this particular girl able to marry a Kohen? Al tomer lo ksherihi vihi einena ela psula. Don't say that, yes, she can marry a Kohen, when in fact, she can't marry a Kohen. They both say, so again, that's an example ultimately of placing a stumbling block, because the person may actually take action based on what it is that I'm saying, and I may be causing them to transgress a certain prohibition. If a person's asking you advice, don't give a person bad advice. I both say, it's interesting that Ramchal doesn't say bad advice. Instead, what does he say? Don't give a person advice that's not good for them. You know, sometimes you may not be saying something false, but it may not be the right advice for that particular individual. Va'al tomerlo, michar sadcha v'kach lecha ve'ata okef alav v'not le'mer. Now, I both say, now there are some circumstances where you're just directly taking advantage. For example, I go over to Reuven and say, Reuven, you know what? Real estate market is really tanking, but the donkey market is really on its way up. So here's what you should do: sell off your real estate, use the proceeds to go ahead and buy donkeys. Right? Meanwhile, what do? I go ahead and I take advantage and I buy the real estate. Shabbos says, so that's an example of lifnei iver. Now, again, obviously, it could be a situation if the advice we're going to see. There's two ways to look at that case. Case number one could be that the advice is wrong. The advice is wrong. So if the advice is wrong, it's terrible. The second possibility could be the advice is correct. Maybe the advice is correct, but Lamaisa, what's the problem? I'm saying something not for the benefit of Reuven, but rather again, why am I saying it? For my own benefit. I'm giving Reuven advice to benefit myself. Shema Tomar, Eitza Yafani. So here it is. So you'll say, but 1 second, it's true. The real estate market is really going down, and the donkey market is really going up. So I'm giving him good advice. They both say, at the end of the day, a person knows in their heart, and more importantly, HaKadosh Baruch Hu knows. When I give advice, am I giving the advice to benefit the individual, or am I giving advice ultimately to benefit me? Listen to this. We learn shebein b'davar sheyachal lios nogea bo, ubein b'davar she'eni nogea bo klal. So therefore, I will say whether I'm dispensing advice in a situation where I have a vested interest, or what we call a negios, I have a vested interest, or in a situation where I don't have a vested interest, chayiv adam lahamid es habali his yaitzbo ala emes hazoch lahabara. When a person is asked to give advice, a person must make sure to give advice in a way that ultimately, again, is truthful, zach is pure, and baror is clear. I will say, by the way, I just want to point out, this is much harder than we think, because whether we realize it or not, there's a conscious bias, there's a subconscious bias. So when people ask us for advice, one has to be so careful that they're really advancing the right advice for that individual and not saying something because it might be to my benefit or my benefit. This year, the Rebbe listen to this. Sha'am the Torah asov daitam sharamam. The Rebbe say again. Let's listen. The Torah itself understands how people often work in a situation. Delo b'shoftani askinon shi'atsu eitza shirasa meforsemis v'niglis. So Rebbe say more often than not, where does this become a challenge? This is not talking about a case where I'm giving someone bad advice, right? That's obvious, right? That's obvious. Giving someone bad advice, detrimental advice, of course is going to be usher. But Ramchal says, that's not where the nuance of this issue lies. He says, Ela b'chachamim lahara, asher yitnu eitza lechavreim, lifnei hanigla ba, yesh ba min harevach el chavera be'emes. You both say the challenge is like this. There are times I give my friend advice, and the advice actually looks like good advice. It looks on the surface, it looks like I'm really giving good direction. But at the end of the day, the way the advice results, it's not for the benefit of my friend. But rather it's to his detriment and to my benefit. And I would take this one step further. We're going to see, even in a situation where the advice that I'm giving is to my friend's benefit, but the reason I'm giving it is why? To benefit myself, that's also a problem. You see, what the Torah is trying to highlight to us is that if somebody comes to you for guidance, only give it in a way that you feel you're doing so for the absolute benefit of the other individual. If there is some vested interest for me, don't do it. Say, you know what? I'm too close to it. Why? Because once I'm involved, right? Once the advice becomes about me, then at the end of the day, it's hard to really know with absolute certainty that I'm dispensing the right advice. You will say, you know what? This comes up very often. It's interesting. I think this comes up very often with adult children. With adult children, right? And by the way, when I say adult, it doesn't have to be like adult, even like young adult. Sometimes it's very hard. As a parent, right, there are things that I want for my child. And I believe my child should do but yet my child also has to find their own way, has to find, so it's hard. So sometimes a child will come to a parent for advice, and there's that moment where you're coming to me, you're asking me, here's what I would like you to do, but then I'm not sure. Is that the right derech for you right now? It's complicated. Again, happens in many, but alright, let's go. He says, Ach sofa inyan, maybe a person will say, so we'll say, see, when it comes to this particular situation, what's important to know is, you could fool other people, you could fool yourself. The one person or the one entity you can't fool is HaKadosh Baruch Hu. Because that's why the Torah says, and the Torah in that context also, one should have a fear of Hashem. In other words, at the end of the day, recognize that you're going to have to go ahead and give judgment to HaKadosh Baruch Hu for any advice that you dispense to another. And even if you've convinced yourself it's for the benefit of the petitioner, and even if the petitioner is convinced that you gave him good advice, because Baruch Hu knows that you gave wrong advice or you gave advice that was to your benefit, one is accountable for that. The Kam Nichshalim Adam Beilach Hatam Yom Yom Biyosam Kiruim V'Holchim L'Tokev Chem Das Habatza. And Ramchal says the truth is where often this comes up is when it comes to money. And how often does it happen that people come to us and perhaps again there's for some financial advice, and I realize that I have the opportunity here that if I steer the person in a particular direction, I will benefit. Now, maybe they'll benefit also. In other words, you don't have to be talking about a case where I'm going to benefit, they're going to lose, because that's much more obvious that it's wrong. But even in a case where I'm going to benefit and they're going to benefit, but maybe it's not the right type of benefit for them, or maybe they could benefit more in a different situation. So hard, I will say, to resist that temptation to not give the self-serving advice. Therefore, I will say, let's finish this up. Says Ramchal. So what is my obligation? This is really incredible. When someone comes to me for advice, so I'll say this is such a fascinating litmus test. When you give advice to someone, give advice in a way that it would be the same kind of advice that you would want to receive if you were asking advice from someone. The same way that if you're asking advice, you would want the person who you're turning to think about you and only you, and not give you advice that benefited you and them, but would want them, so I'll say, when dispensing advice, give the same type of advice you would like to receive. Only focus ultimately again on the benefit of the person who's asking you. And don't have anything else in mind. So we'll say, what happens if someone comes to me for advice? And what happens? I realize that if I give them the right advice, it's to my detriment. It could happen. It's to my detriment. You know what I say? Sometimes in life when someone comes to you for advice, and you know that the truth is you're in a compromised situation regarding this particular issue, sometimes what do you have to do? You just recuse yourself. You just say very nicely, you know what? I can't do it. There's a conflict, there's this, that, too much. Sometimes a person just has to remove themselves from the scenario. Don't, I will say, at the end of the day, just make sure that when dispensing advice, if somebody comes to you, you have one mission and one mission only, which is give them the best advice for them, and your personal needs should not play into the advice that you give to another. Imlo shakavanas hamisyais lara shazvaday mitzvah l'ramoso kvar nemar v'im ikesh tispato v'chushe argyocher. We'll say, okay, so we'll stop with this. But Ramchal says there is one exception to this. One exception to this is if someone's coming to you to do something bad, right? They're going to do something bad and they're asking you advice about it, right? Then in that case, absolutely give bad advice, right? In that case, again, you're absolutely permitted to tell them something that's going to derail their negative activities. But that's an extreme case. But in every other case, Ramchal says, be careful that when someone comes for you for advice, give them the advice that is good for them and avoid the temptation to give them advice that's good for them, but also is self-serving for you. Shabbos says, so once again, Ramchal points out over here something truly amazing, which is, again, this idea that this is here in the middle of Nikios, because so often in life we're asked for advice regarding different things, but at the end of the day we fall into the trap of not giving the right advice for the other, but rather fall into the trap of self-serving advice that may be good for another, but I have an opportunity to advance my own life agenda. Says Ramchal, be so careful with this avera that so many get wrapped up. And I'll stop over here for today. Shkoyach.